Hailing from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the glam metal band Cinderella achieved success in the 80s with a pair of multi-platinum studio albums whose singles garnered heavy play on MTV and radio. But as the 90s would roll around, the band would end up running into a changing musical scene and health issues that ultimately stopped them in their tracks. Today, let's talk about the history of the band Cinderella. The story of Cinderella really begins with guitarist and vocalist Tom Keifer, who hailed from the suburbs of Philadelphia. It was at the age of 8 that he was inspired by the Monkees, which resulted in him wanting to learn guitar. However, it wasn't always a straight path to music, as he soon had another inspiration, which would be magic. He would be inspired by Doug Henning, and that resulted in Keifer becoming a magician for a few years. Keifer was also into musical acts like Led Zeppelin, Nazareth, Humble Pie, Janis Joplin, Aerosmith, and UFO, which had a huge influence on his later career. It was in junior high that he started playing in his first band, and they would do covers, and he would play guitar in that group, and they would actually have each member taking turns singing. The East Coast scene was pretty interesting back then, as bands could attract huge audiences and make a ton of money simply by playing cover tunes. One of the bands who really succeeded at doing this was Twisted Sister, with frontman Dee Snider admitting in the book Nothin' But a Good Time that the band in today's dollars were pulling around $370,000 a year, before taxes of course. But for Tom Keifer, he wasn't into the idea, revealing in the same book, it was so lucrative on the East Coast and the cover bands were so popular. It was like living the fantasy without doing the work to create your own music. Prior to performing Cinderella, Keifer would play in a cover band called Saints in Hell. He was pretty young, still in high school at the time, and he was actually enrolled in a work-study program. Funny enough, the school thought that he was working a day job, but really in reality he was actually sleeping, and he would play clubs in the evening 5 nights a week in both Jersey and Philadelphia. He was also doing a lot of partying around this time and struggled with substance abuse. At one point, Keifer contemplated simply dropping out of high school, but his mother bribed him to stay, promising him a Gibson Les Paul, something he still owns. Apart from playing covers, bands on the East Coast really had to have good visuals, and Saints in Hell did. The group's frontman would breathe fire and even cut himself on stage with glass. It was sometime in the early 80s, a day before a scheduled Halloween gig in Ocean City, Maryland, that Keifer would find himself in a bathroom stall next to local bassist Eric Brittingham. Keifer was in the bathroom with one of his bandmates, and they were complaining about their bass player when Keifer tapped Brittingham on the shoulder and asked him if he played bass. Brittingham responded that he actually did, but he didn't have a bass at the moment. Despite this, Keifer invited him to come jam with the band the next day, and he could use their current bassist equipment. They would end up doing some Kiss covers, and Saints in Hell now had their new bass player. But it wasn't too long after that Keifer soon grew disillusioned with where his life was at, thinking that he was really going nowhere. He would move back in with his parents, he would confront his substance abuse issues, and he got a few day jobs. One was actually at a place called Photomat, picking up film that had to be developed, and he even walked racehorses, something that I didn't even know was a thing, but apparently they're called hot walkers. It was during this time he started to write songs, and in 1983, him and Brittingham started the outfit Cinderella. Keifer fronted the group, playing guitar and becoming the principal songwriter. Perhaps one of the strangest parts of the band was the name, Cinderella. It gives off these vibes that the band was soft, but Keifer would explain to the LA Times why they used the moniker, revealing, "We found the name because we were looking through an HBO guide one day. We saw the movie Cinderella listed and thought it would be a good name for us. We wanted something that didn't have any heavy metal associations. Cinderella doesn't play what you'd expect a band called Cinderella to play. We like it that way." The group would end up being allowed to rehearse in the upper story of a New Jersey joint called the Galaxy Club. Keifer's days would be pretty jam-packed, as he would work from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m, and then afterwards he would go rehearse with his band. And it was during this period he wrote about 20 to 30 songs. Cinderella soon hit the studio and would record some demos with the intent of nabbing a record deal. According to Brittingham in the book Nothin' But a Good Time, the band spent nearly a year writing songs before they even played their first gig. Helping round out the lineup at the time would be drummer Tony Destra and guitarist Michael Kelly Smith. Smith at one point had actually auditioned for Kiss and still had Gene Simmons' phone number. In fact, while a lot has been written about how John Bon Jovi was instrumental in Cinderella's success, it was actually Gene Simmons who first tried to get the band a record deal. The members even went to Gene Simmons' home in New York, but they weren't really on the same wavelength. Simmons wanted to sign the group to a production deal where he would write Cinderella songs, but Brittingham would admit that he thought the songs Gene came up with were really bad, so they passed on the opportunity. The band soon started playing some live shows, and they were doing a weekly residency at the Galaxy on Saturday nights. Despite playing to small crowds, Keifer electrified audiences, and soon enough record label people started showing up to those gigs. But there was a problem. Cinderella couldn't land a major recording deal because, according to the band's manager, a guy named Larry Mazer, the labels had an issue with Keifer's voice. Mazer would recall in the book Nothing But a Good Time, "I thought his voice was a plus because at this point in time, Aerosmith had just returned and had come out with Done With Mirrors, which was not a great record because they were still in their heroin phase. AC/DC was in that period of Fly on the Wall, Flick of the Switch, Who Made Who, which weren't great AC/DC records. And here's Cinderella right down the middle of Aerosmith and AC/DC. The closest the band would get to actually signing a recording contract was with Atlantic Records, but the label instead chose to sign Savatage, thinking that they would have a bigger future. In the meantime, Cinderella became local celebrities when they appeared in a hot dog commercial, as you can see here. If you're wondering how this happened, the owner of the hot dog joint saw the band play a show and asked them to be in the ad. The band's luck, though, was about to change. It would be at one of their gigs that John Bon Jovi was in attendance and took an immediate liking to the band. Bon Jovi was actually in town making his second record, 7800 Degrees Fahrenheit. And keep in mind, Bon Jovi wasn't yet a multi-platinum band. John would end up pushing Derek Shulman from Polygram Records to check the band out. Shulman, funny enough though, had already heard the band's demo and passed on signing Cinderella. But at the insistence of John, he came down and saw the band's live show. But Shulman still wasn't completely sold, and while he recognized the talents of Keifer and Brittingham, he did have some creative suggestions for the group. He would tell their manager that he wasn't really impressed with the group's guitar player and drummer. He suggested to them that if they could get some better musicians, including a more flashy guitar player, then he would offer them a development deal that was somewhere in the amount of $30,000 over 3 months. Keifer wasn't necessarily bothered by the suggestions because at this point in Cinderella's history, he was already having musical disagreements with his drummer and his guitarist. The pair would leave the band and form the outfit Britny Fox, who would go on to have their own share of success. Sadly though, drummer Tony Destra would pass away in 1987 due to a car accident. As Cinderella turned their attention to recruiting 2 new musicians, it would be Skid Row guitarist Dave Snake Sabo who auditioned for the group. He wouldn't get the gig though, as it would end up going to Jeff Labar. The band members chalked up that decision to the fact that Sabo was buddies with John Bon Jovi and had a bit of an attitude, and number 2 is that he was incessantly calling them asking if he got the gig. Labar, for his part, had actually played in a band that opened for Cinderella a number of times in Jersey, so they already knew him and he just seemed like a better fit overall. The band would sign a development deal with Polygram, and then that soon resulted in a record deal. The band would end up enlisting drummer Jody Cortez for their first album. Released in 1986, Cinderella's debut record Night Songs struggled right out of the gate. Polygram would release the lead single as Shake Me, and perhaps not helping the initial sales was the album cover, which really did a disservice to the type of music that Cinderella was playing. The band had an alternative cover planned, but the label rejected it simply because none of the band members were on it. The original cover had Night Songs written in water on a piece of glass. As for the band's clothing choices on the record, Keifer claimed that they were trying to look like Aerosmith, and in reality it was the 80s, and that's how all the bands were dressing at the time. The band would catch a break though when the follow-up single Nobody's Fool landed on radio and MTV, with the song peaking at number 13 on the Hot 100 charts, and the song, while not specifically written for a particular person, would deal with falling out of love. The band also had another single in Somebody Save Me, which also charted. With the rise of the Parents Music Resource Center, Polygram vetoed including a lyric sheet for the band's first album, fearing unwanted attention from the wrong groups. Keifer would tell the LA Times, "This isn't hardcore sinister metal, but it's not angelic either. Some of the songs are a bit sexually suggestive. The stuff Prince sings is much worse." As the band soon turned their attention to touring for the album, they would be without a drummer, and initially Polygram were pushing for former Kiss drummer Eric Singer to take the spot, but he was in Lita Ford's band and really wasn't interested. Jeff Labar, though, was a fan of a group called Chastain, and he knew the drummer, a guy named Fred Coury. Coury would hear from Eric Singer that Cinderella was looking for a drummer, but in all honesty, he didn't even know about the band or what their music sounded like. He actually thought it was an all-girl band, and he blew off the idea of even auditioning for them. It was upon listening to their first record that he soon changed his mind, and in a funny twist, Coury would actually end up signing a Chastain record for Jeff Labar about 1 year prior to joining the group. The group's first major arena tour would be opening for David Lee Roth, and as Night Songs continued to climb up the charts, the band started to get hit with some restrictions from Dave's people. Labar would recall in the book Nothin' But a Good Time, "The better our album did, the more restrictions they tried to put on us. At one point, Tom was told that he was not allowed to speak in between songs. We pointed out how ridiculous that was, so then they said, okay, you're allowed to say the name of the city and the name of the song." Cinderella soon jumped to a bigger tour, linking up with Bon Jovi for their Slippery When Wet tour, and that further catapulted their album up the charts. It was on that tour the band also befriended comedian Sam Kinison, who was friendly with a lot of the hard rock bands at the time. He was originally supposed to appear in the video for Somebody Save Me, but the guys from Bon Jovi stepped in at the 11th hour and helped the band out. It was apart from a few hiccups, Night Songs would sell a whopping 3 million copies, and it would become the second biggest debut record since Boston's LP, which came out 10 years prior. The LA Times would remark in 1986 about what a big feat this was, writing, "What makes the success of Night Songs so impressive is that new heavy metal bands rarely sell very well. In fact, even veteran heavy metal bands aren't selling well these days," they'd write. Despite the strong commercial performance, critics didn't initially praise Cinderella. In fact, Rolling Stone would write about the album, and I quote, "Too much pose, not punch." But the reviews really did little to bother the members, with Keifer telling the Spokesman Review, "I've never really read a bad review about us or another band that I thought was fair. It's mostly a bunch of cheap shots." The band's secret weapon has always been Tom Keifer. In fact, drummer Fred Coury would reveal just how the band avoided the sophomore slump, telling the Eugene Register, "A lot of people, they go on the road for the first album, just do the tour, and then they get off the road, and the record company says, well, we need an album's worth of stuff. They have a couple months to write 10 songs, and it just doesn't work that way. They force it, and the album just starts feeling horrible." In fact, by the time the band got off the road for their first record, Keifer had already written a majority of the second album. Keifer would admit in various interviews that a big inspiration for the group's second record, titled Long Cold Winter, would be the fact that until the band got signed, he hadn't really ventured too far outside of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So touring and seeing places resulted in him feeling emotions that, he hadn't really felt before, and so he poured these emotions into music. Keifer also wanted to take the band in a different direction. A lot of records that were being produced around this time had a very slick production style, like Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet and Poison's Look What the Cat Dragged In. Keifer would tell an interviewer, "With Long Cold Winter, we started to think about production more. We started to have more organic instruments, pianos, and acoustics. We toned down the slickness or the processing a little bit, although that record's still pretty slick." Absent from the recording sessions was drummer Fred Coury, who Keifer admitted was a little too young and he was really inexperienced at the time. At the request of the band's producer Andy Johns, it would be Jeff Beck drummer Cozy Powell who would play on a majority of the drum tracks on the record. Coury would, however, tour with the band and appear on their follow-up record. Long Cold Winter would produce Cinderella's biggest hit of their career, the power ballad Don't Know What You Got Till It's Gone, which would peak one spot higher than Nobody's Fool on the Hot 100 charts. The song actually predated the group's first album, dating back to 1985, shortly after the band signed with Polygram. It was while the band was actually working on night songs. Keifer was driving to the studio one day and the idea came to him for the song. But as the band worked on the track for their first record, they couldn't quite get the feel that they wanted, so it was shelved for the time being. Funny enough, this song would be immortalized in an episode of South Park. The album produced several other notable hits, including Comin' Home and Gypsy Road, both of which appeared on the Hot 100 charts. Long Cold Winter would sell an impressive 3 million copies, proving that Cinderella wasn't a flash in the pan. I also want to point out that one of my subscribers has been asking me incessantly to do a story about MTV's Long Cold Winter contest, but honestly I haven't been able to find any information on the winner, so if you guys have any more details on this contest, please leave a comment down below and maybe I can do a video on it. In 1989, it was a pretty notable year for Cinderella as they appeared at the Moscow Music Peace Festival alongside Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Ozzy, and Skid Row. Despite having commercial success, Cinderella, though, never would achieve the kind of success that Motley Crue and Bon Jovi did. Their manager would recall in Nothin' But a Good Time, and I quote, "We didn't become the bona fide arena sellout that Poison did, Rat did, Bon Jovi did, Motley Crue did, whatever. I think because the guys were more like Dokken or Great White. But they didn't play up to that showbiz Hollywood tabloid thing, in a way that kept them from becoming even bigger," he would remark. The band's follow-up record, Heartbreak Station, would arrive in 1990. The band would look back to the 70s for inspiration, taking cues from the Stones and Led Zeppelin. The album would actually be recorded across several studios in several different states, and the album is quite eclectic and probably the most wide-ranging of all the records they've put out. The band spent a fortune making the album, and the label spent a fortune marketing it. In fact, the band's manager would recall in the same book how the launch party was held in New Orleans, one of the cities the album was recorded in, and about 200 journalists were flown in all over the world, and they went on a riverboat cruise and had a huge fireworks display, and they had a listening party as well. The label ponied up $250,000 for this party. In fact, Headbangers Ball on MTV did a show from this release party. You can check it out on YouTube. The album would end up selling about 1 million copies, but it couldn't match the commercial success of its predecessor, largely due to the fact that there was this changing musical scene and, well, just bad luck and even bad decisions. The label would release Shelter Me as the lead single, and while it did well, the band's manager thought it was too big of a shift for the band's existing fan base. There was also a global incident that occurred that would end up scuttling momentum for the album. The band would book a sold-out European tour in early 1991, and the Gulf War broke out. It was a few years prior the band had actually played Europe, and they were originally booked for the Pan Am 103 plane that exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. But of course the band didn't board the plane. That was an incident that was still fresh in the minds of both the band and their crew. It was after playing several shows in England, the band and their crew voted to simply head back home, fearing that Europe could suddenly be attacked by Iraq. Cinderella's manager, however, tried to convince the members that Scud missiles couldn't reach Europe, but he failed to do so. Cinderella would head back home in January of '91, and the Gulf War ended almost a month later. The band soon would turn their attention to a North American tour, and that ended up being an abysmal failure. It was only several shows in when the promoters started panicking over low ticket sales, and the band were now losing money on each show they were playing, and eventually they had to pull the plug. It became apparent that the glam metal scene that Cinderella was so often associated or lumped in with was no longer popular. Grunge and alternative rock were the new kids in school, and adding to the band's problems was that in 1991 Tom Keifer started suffering from paralysis of his left vocal cord, and he was told by doctors that he may never sing again. He would, however, sing again, but by the time he recovered with his voice, it ended up delaying the release of Cinderella's follow-up record, 1994, Still Climbing, but the album was a total commercial failure. The band even admitted how MTV showed no love for them, with Keifer telling Deseret News, "MTV called our marketing director and told him not to bother with the video because it would not get played. They took Headbangers Ball off the air and said even if Guns N' Roses were to make a video, it wouldn't be played. I mean, Guns N' Roses made MTV, now they're turning their backs on them." tour would end up seeing the band playing to dwindling crowds. They would play one show in Seattle in the mid-90s, and by this point grunge was so popular that one radio station in town was so anti-80s glam metal, they simply refused to sell advertising for Cinderella's show. Cinderella were soon dropped by their label, and the band would take a temporary hiatus. It was during this time Tom Keifer would move to Nashville, and he began working as a songwriter and even began working on his first solo record, but it would be shelved when Cinderella reformed a couple years later in 1996. Their old label put out a greatest hits release, and in 1998 the band would sign to Sony, and they began working on their long-awaited comeback record, but nothing ever materialized. Jeff Labar would reveal that Sony wasn't really interested in the material that Cinderella was working on and told them to keep writing. Also adding to the problems was that Sony was going through a lot of corporate changes, which resulted in new management cleaning house, and Cinderella soon got into a prolonged legal battle with Sony for the next several years. In the aftermath of that, Cinderella would continue to tour, and Keifer put out 2 solo records, and the other members also drifted into other projects. It was in 2008 Keifer suffered a hemorrhage of one of his vocal cords, hindering touring plans at that point in time. The band would play their final shows together in 2014, with Keifer announcing in 2017 that the band was finished because the band members' interpersonal relationships were, and I quote, beyond repair. Labar would shed some more light on the existing issues, telling the Effin' Podcast with Izzy Presley in 2016, "I can only speculate, but I believe it's my fault. It's no secret that I have a drinking problem, and it showed its ugly face on one of those cruises that Cinderella played." Keifer continues to play with his solo band, while Brittingham is a member of Bret Michaels' band, while drummer Fred Corey actually works out of his LA studio, working on a lot of music for both sports and television. Sadly though, in July of 2021, guitarist Jeff Labar would pass away at the age of 58. Keifer would tell Eddie, "I know everybody in that band trunk. I've got to tell you, you're never really ready for that kind of loss. You're not prepared to hear that kind of thing, and everyone is still trying to grieve and process it. It's an emotional topic. Jeff was such a passionate, amazing person, musician, human." That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.